Hello and welcome to this month's edition of African Liberty Webinar. Today we'll be talking about the interesting relationship between China and African countries. Certainly the last 20 years we've seen a significant growth, especially in the financial relationship between African countries and China. We've seen billions of loans sent from Beijing to African governments, and we've seen a significant increase in the rate of Chinese investments in Africa. And today, to dissect this issue with me are Chris Arthing from the Free Market Foundation, Rejoice Ngwenya, one of the co-chair at Komaliso, a think tank in Zimbabwe, Anna Ryder, the CEO of Development Reimagine, a consultancy based in Beijing, and the president of ILAPI, Peter Bismarck-Coffey. Welcome, everybody. So first, I'm going to go to Chris, and I want to know what you think about the overall perception of this trade relations between, not only trade relations, financial relations between African countries and China.
So up until this point, obviously, countries have relied a lot on loans, and that's the norm. Do we want to pursue that, or do we want to pursue a different model? Do we want to pursue the model where private businesses and companies engage directly with Chinese companies and the Chinese government, or do we want to work through African governments? I guess that's a bigger question we need to decide. What route do we follow? We should also remember that, and when it comes to questions of trade, it's individuals trading with each other. It's not just these big countries or corporates or entities, these faceless things trading with each other. It's individuals trading with each other. So if I can get a benefit from trading with someone in China, then I should be allowed to sort of pursue that sort of thing. Then it comes in, well, what are you going to get out of it? What are you not going to get out of it? You need to decide for yourself. So do we want to allow that sort of level of individual freedom or not? Again, like I said, that's a meta question. I think you could argue that for large parts of the last century, even Africa has been so hobbled by different colonial influences. If you want to consider China, let's consider now China a colonial influence as well. If you want to consider the European powers colonial, Africa for so long has been hobbled by colonial powers trying to use African resources for themselves. Perhaps we have reached the point where African governments as well should take a step back and allow individual businesses and people to trade with whomever they want around the world and not have these restrictions on what businesses can do.
Rejoice, you see, Chris is saying the private sector has a bigger role to play, but Rejoice, considering the fact that majority of this financial relation has been basically in loan, not necessarily trade, but it could be on the same par, but we've seen an enormous surge in loans in the last 17 years. But do you think, Rejoice, considering your experience in Southern Africa, that Africa has to focus more on getting loan from China for it to develop, or it needs to focus more on other aspects, perhaps trade, perhaps working with other countries in Asia or other economic powers to develop? But is it going to be about loan for Africa to fund these development projects?
Well, that's kind of question that I would ask, the typical Zimbabwean ruling party, crony, that why has our relationship with the IMF and the ADB and the World Bank collapsed? It has not collapsed because we are not getting enough loans. It has collapsed because we are failing to pay back those loans which we are given. In other words, if China is not giving due diligence to our capacity to repay back the loans, then we are shifting from the zone of loan hunger more to development aid, a high appetite for development aid. And that becomes a problem, because when it comes in as development aid or as loans with very low interest, it doesn't give African governments the capacity to weigh their potential of developing themselves. We become addicted, we become dependent on Chinese benevolence. And that's where the things go bad, because when the the Chinese, they will have to wait for a time when there is a true African democratic revolution. And I don't think the next generation of Africans is going to accept to pay back these loans, because these loans are given out on partisan grounds in the way, for instance, how we support Chinese political relationship with the United Nations. So Hannah is very right. We need a huge, package of loans to develop our infrastructure. But I keep insisting that these things should be private sector driven, so that whatever money comes in can trickle down to those individuals and companies that are involved in infrastructure development. Now, when it's the Chinese doing it, we don't even know how much we are paying back. Even in Zimbabwe, we don't even know. We are told that we owe the Chinese 7 billion, but economy says probably about 11 to 12 billion. So this whole opaque thing of doing business between the government of China and the government of Zimbabwe is the one that is creating problems in terms of us measuring the potency or the effectiveness of the indebtedness of our country. So I'm in a pretty nervous and anxious territory here, Ibrahim.
See, I really don't want to say it gets more complicated when we have to think about the fact that Africa is just confined to borrowing money to fund its development project. I mean, we lose over $150 billion every year to corruption alone. And our debt to China is around the same range, which means if we can fix corruption, of course, we're going to have, funds to power our development needs, not necessarily going to China, but it's just really, dawn to me in the last few months that perhaps we do not have any option but to turn to China. But considering these facts, and also what you said, Rejoice, that this generation of leaders are not going to be the one to pay for the loans. It's going to be my generation, our children's generation that will have to repay China. But Anna, do you think it's kind of valid, considering the fact that majority of these agreements, first, are in secret, and second of all, we've seen that when African countries and perhaps other countries have defaulted on their Chinese loans, China seems to seize their national assets or some kind of crazy collateral in the agreements. So do you think, Hannah, that seizing national assets or seizing huge collaterals of national interest is justifiable considering the relationship between the two actors?
So let me first agree with Joyce in terms of what he was saying on the importance of thinking about the terms of loans, really, because actually those loans that did, when we had structural adjustment in African countries, ended up with huge debts in the past, and we then had the initiative to cancel debts for a huge number of countries, African countries included. That was not because of the debt, full stop. What it was because of was because of the terms of the debt, right? Why were the interest rates variable? And there was the fact that the interest rates were variable that meant that the repayment was too difficult, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're not having a conversation yet about Chinese loans is, and in comparison to others even, do we know what the interest rates are on all of our World Bank loans? Do we? And actually, we do still get the majority of our loans from the World Bank. But it is a fact that many countries can't access loans from the World Bank. So even the cheapest loans, for example, Kenya, we're a middle-income country. That's my country. We're middle-income. We can't access the cheapest loans from the World Bank. So we have to go to the private sector. We also go to China. We look around. And the way to think about a loan at a country level is the way that one thinks about a loan at an individual level.
Right.
Well, I might need to go and get a loan to go to university. Is that a bad use of money? No, but let me go to university and make sure I get a job. So it's about the productivity of the loan. So we should be asking our leaders to definitely be more transparent about what the loan terms are. And we should also be asking them to make sure that they're really productive. Now, coming to this question about assets and seizing assets. So this is another part of the loan terms. And there's all sorts of different types of loans with China, of course. So you have loans which have the collateral and even the repayment is made through natural resources, oil, for example. and you can actually get a flow of finance from that directly to China at a specific price for those natural resources, agreed early on. And then there's also others where the collateral is some kind of asset. Now we don't know exactly what has happened in all those loan agreements. Those aren't typically published. From what we understand, there is no necessary restriction on publishing them from the Chinese side, but if African leaders decide to publish them, they can. So, those information requests out. I mean, yeah, we should be doing that. But on the other hand, there are cases, for example, there is Sri Lanka case, which is widely reported in the media to be a seizing of a port. And there's a fairly strong, pretty good American author called Deborah Brown, who's gone into a lot of detail about that case and really showing that and explaining the case in the sense that it is a shift from a loan to more of a foreign debt investment because the Sri Lankan government themselves felt that they could not handle all the repayment and the port wasn't working as well as they thought it and hoped it would do by running it themselves. So they asked a Chinese company to help. In Kenya, again, our SGR is being operated at the moment by a Chinese company. Is that a problem? Well, maybe it is, but hopefully it's also something in which Kenyans can overall eventually start to also hold and use that to be able to get the profits themselves and also be mostly employed on it. We need to discuss the very specific cases.
I'm glad you actually make mention of, what Kenya is benefiting from this agreement with China. And does bring us to another phase of this whole relation, especially when it comes to what Africa is getting in return from this agreement. And I remember last month, there was a sort of frenzy in Luanda, DR Congo, about what China is giving to DR Congo. When the Chinese made an agreement with DR Congo, I think it was just 2 years ago, some protocol called Seco Mines, where, China is going to get, mineral resources from DR Congo, and in return, invest in universities, in infrastructures, build, hospitals and so. We've seen tons of, copper and cobalt transferred from DRC to China over the years, but we haven't really seen the reciprocity of this agreement in DR Congo. As a matter of fact, Johns Hopkins Institute of China-Africa Relations recently made an investigation on ground in DRC, and many of the people they spoke to said they haven't, seen equilibrium or at least a minimum replication of what China said it was going to do in the agreement. And this brings the question: why would we continue to involve ourselves in a frenzy of deal or loan agreements when we're not equally getting something back? Ditto Kenya, ditto Nigeria. So, right. What do you think is the way out for Africa, or even if at all we need to stay in this deal, Chris?
I think it should always be clearly defined country by country what sort of things they want from Africa. So trade, ideally, we should always think of trade as a win-win. It shouldn't always just be one side winning more than the other side. It should always be 50-50. Yeah, right. Otherwise, why would you trade with someone if it's not a win-win? I think that's the beauty about trade throughout the history of the world, is countries and individuals should both benefit from the trade. So I think going forward, individual African countries should just be clear on what their limitations and demands are. We've talked about the IMF, we've talked about China. They're clear on what their demands and limits are. So African countries and governments should feel empowered to do the same. It's their resources, it's their people with their skills and abilities putting in the work. So why, I think that's a moral thing for them to sort of demand that X, Y, and Z should happen. What those specifics are, again, it's up to each country. In South Africa, maybe we want China to come in and help us build, I don't know, power stations, for example, because that's a big thing we need at the moment. Without a stable supply of electricity, our economy simply can't function. So, for example, that's one thing we would want to be clear on is you need to do this. I think another important aspect would be sustainability and long-term viability of projects and good quality of infrastructure. It can't just be something that only lasts for a year or 2 years. It should be a 10-year sort of requirement. If China wants to come and build stuff in an African country, it should be for the long term. Otherwise, I don't really see any particular reason why you should allow that sort of investment and trade to happen.
So, Rejoice, your country, Zimbabwe, is one of the most indebted African countries to China, and I think in some quarters it's reported to be about 200% of the GDP, about $11 billion. That's really enormous. But Rejoice, what has Zimbabwe benefited from this trade deal or loan deal with China in the last decade?
Right. When Mnangagwa took over from Mugabe, there was a frenzy of signatures around what he used to call mega deals. That about 2 years ago, big numbers touted, 50,000 people employed, power stations refurbished, and so forth. But 2 years down the line, we are still suffering from this very same malady of poverty and very non-productive industrial capacity that we were before Mugabe left. So the question being, as Crystal says, who is benefiting? I mean, this is largely extractive relationship. I mean, we probably export some of the best tobacco, not just in Africa, but in the world, but it goes to China as tobacco. It doesn't go to China as cigarettes. So this is a very skewed relationship. So, okay, one can argue that there's been some marginal, improvement in certain, sectors. For instance, health, when the Chinese invest in hospitals, and when they invest in certain mining companies. But I still insist that until we move out of this extractive relationship, I want to see, mining companies in Zimbabwe, I want to see tobacco companies in Zimbabwe signing agreements to export cigarettes and processed chrome. I don't want to be seeing bales of millions of dollars of bales of tobacco being shipped to China. That is not good. So my humble position, guys, is that I don't think we have gotten the best value of our relationship. If anything, it's only the few government cronies that are very close to Mnangagwa that have benefited in chrome and tobacco deals. And that is criminal. And I can assure you that the next generation of Democrats in this country, they are going to disown these loans and agreement. And we are going to support that revolution, against repaying of these odious loans.
Well, that's...
Sorry, Ibrahim, if I could jump in there. I just wanted to mention, I think just one sort of small example as part of like a deal with China, there should be some sort of aspect of upskilling. When a Chinese company or the government comes to an African country, there should be some sort of skills transfer or training for people in that African country so that it could be a long-term thing. And then that also gives African governments and people the incentive to want Chinese companies and governments to come here. Whereas now, and I agree with Rejoice, whereas it's been an exploitative sort of relationship and situation, it's breeding this resentment and this feeling of, no, we don't want China here. We don't want that. I mean, and that's self-defeating. That's defeating the purpose. We want investment. We want trade. But there should definitely be some sort of look towards the long term. Why not get Chinese companies and the government to come here and train people, help them build their own businesses and factories and companies? And then it's it's sort of a symbiotic 50-50 relationship going forward.
Oh, I would like Anna to kind of defend this position.
I completely agree. We have a huge potential to get a lot more out of the relationship, and it doesn't need to be one which is, our focus doesn't need just to be around loans. We absolutely need to be trade. 74% of the African countries have trade deficits with China at the moment, right? Certainly, Kenya does an absolutely awful one, but it's not a lot. And similarly, we also don't have much foreign direct investment coming in. But then again, also China is not the only one in this sense. Many other countries we also have trade deficits with. Actually China imported as a proportion of all of the imports from the world. China imported 4%, as I mentioned, from Africa, but then the US imported 1.4%. So we need to be working on our relationships. We need to be taking these things much more seriously, and definitely added value has to be part of that. Making sure that we are trading and sending added value products to the world is huge. But how do we get there? We have to invest. We have to have infrastructure. We also have to be having factories coming to our countries and business.
But Anna,
really
talking about
how
factory and investment, let's just be very much objective here. Anytime, in fact, 9 out of 10 times, China has a construction or infrastructure agreement with an African country. Okay, come build this major highway from Sambisa to Nairobi. 9 out of the 10 times, you're gonna see China import its own experts, engineers, and construction workers from China. Do you want to tell me we don't have engineers in Nairobi that can construct this railway to be world class? I mean, what's the defense for this, Anna?
In the past, our leaders haven't asked for those experts to be local, first of all. But so therefore, if that's not included in the agreement, what you want is the Chinese side will decide, and they would much rather bring their own labor because it's much easier. There's a language barrier, etc. And certainly, 10 years ago, we didn't have the amount of Chinese by locals. We ourselves as Africans didn't speak as much Chinese as we do now, right? So it's a situation which is changing. We are seeing many more Africans being employed locally with the Chinese projects. And we are seeing, and definitely there's a range of practice across different countries. So a country like Ethiopia, for example, even back in 2012, 2010 sort of time, they were having very, very specific negotiations with the Chinese government on a project. And they would say, okay, we have a 5-year schedule for how many workers are going to be on this project. First year, there'll be majority Chinese, and they even had the number published in a newspaper, how many each year would change. And then by the end of it, there'd be one Chinese and serve how many Europeans. So there are some good practice examples on on all of these issues. The challenge is our African leaders are not using them consistently. They're not exchanging experience, and therefore we're just not getting enough out of every single part of our negotiation with China.
So Rejoice, you just said what Anna said. It's not about China necessarily. It's about African leaders making the best out of the situation. So Rejoice, what will you recommend? I mean, you've worked with quite a number of organizations. What should be the strategy for the African leaders going to the deal with China?
What are government officials doing in China negotiating mega deals on behalf of the private sector in Zimbabwe? They don't know anything about business. So the first port of call, we need to have experts on those panels negotiating business deals on behalf of Zimbabweans. We can't have the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Home Affairs, and the Vice President of, I don't know, portfolio and office that portfolio. They don't understand what business wants in Zimbabwe. Once we get over that bridge, that section, Ibrahim, then we then become confident that those guys that are representing us in negotiating, they are doing it for the full value of our investment, because we are going to pay back the loans. So we can't have some government official sitting there, taking photographs and smiling that these are mega deals. They are not going to be mega deals until the 99% of our youth are employed, the 65% of our factories are open. So let's get the right individuals to go and negotiate those deals. Guys who have got a keen entrepreneurial and corporate sense. Then from then we can begin to assess the value for money. But otherwise, it will be good for Zimbabwe to generate its own capital to do our own, infrastructure development. But as Hannah says, at the end of the day, if you need a loan, but you need to make sure that you get the best value out of it.
Rightly said. But I want to go to a more philosophical aspect of things now. And, one of the fears is the fact that you're giving China a pass to your country's infrastructure, or to influence your social policies. You are in fact exposing yourself to the possibility of communism or the spread of left-wing populist policies in your country, and this is one fear we really cannot not talk about. But I just want to know what you think, Hannah. Do you think African countries should be wary of going into these deals and relations with China, considering the possibility that China is actually harboring the overspreading communism in Africa?
From the kind of work I do, we usually come at the relationship with China from much more of a kind of economic perspective, as opposed to this question of the sort of philosophical or even geopolitical end of it. Just on a very practical level, here in China, yes, there is certain communism in an overarching sense. However, this country runs very much also in a very private entrepreneurial way too. So there's a lot that I recognize from our own country, from traveling around Africa than I do here. So it's not that simple. None of these issues are that simple. And I think, countries have to weigh up the questions, for example, in UN representation, UN votes, and so on, as to who they want to kind of align with and work with. But typically in the UN, for example, China and African countries have worked together pretty well so far in the past. So there's a kind of very strong relationship there, and it doesn't seem that that's going to change anytime soon. But then, we had the Tanzanian influence, also had, Tanzania was very much a kind of communist, socialist state as well. We have our own records and that was from our own, internally, our own decision. So we don't always have to be influenced by others. We also have our decisions to make.
Rightly said. But to a more geopolitical question now, perhaps two of the biggest trade partners of the bigger economic powers in Africa are either China or the US or the EU. But we've seen, the recent escalation of tensions, political tensions among these players, especially with the Iran event. And of course, America has a lot of military bases in Africa, and China is increasing its number of military bases in Africa too. So do you think, Chris, let's start with you, Chris, that African countries should be wary about this aspect of the deal, the possibility of, proliferation of military bases in Africa based off the new or growing tension between America and its counterparts in Asia, Chris?
So I think it's maybe easy for us on the ground. We're not on that geopolitical level, but we come to sort of we try and make easy black and white generalizations, because that's sort of how we try and figure the world out. We either see the US as the bad guy or the good guy, or China as the good guy or the bad guy. On your question, I think it's important, very important for each African country to realize what's important to that particular country. So, for example, let's say the rule of law, the independence of the courts is very important. If that country sees that either the US or China is coming into that country and trying to undermine that sort of thing, they should definitely push back against that. If it's China coming in and trying to buy away people's property rights in that country, if property rights are very important to people in that country, then people should be suspicious. Again, I think it depends on a country by country basis. I don't think we can. There should always be some sort of reason why a particular country is building military bases in another country. There's always, it's a risk. Why is that country weighing up building something in one country versus another country? They're taking some sort of risk, and they're trying to play into their own interests. Every country pursues they try and further their own interests. They try and further what's best for what they think is best for them and for their people. And I think each African country should do the same. They should sort of try and figure out what level of infrastructure planning, mixing of a different country they'll allow. It's up to each of them to decide for themselves.
What do you think of the geopolitics of it, Rejoice? Do you agree with Chris?
I've heard some dreamers in Zimbabwe here saying that just because there's some kind of tension between the USA and China, it opens an opportunity for this continent to get into the slot of upscaling their relationships with their trade relations with China. It's not going to happen. We don't produce enough. I mean, the fact that the Americans know what a mutually beneficial business relationship is like, they're arguing for their space. So, we are just going to suffer because we don't have the capacity, Ibrahim, to contest the imperial strength and the power and the overwhelming, strength of the Chinese, business dragon. So we're just going to be whimpering on the side. But I appreciate that really we need to sympathize with Africa in the sense that we don't have the necessary political and economic clout to contest with them. They will always come to Africa on their own terms, and it is a pity. Because even the Chinese, trade attaché a few months ago, when I ran a program for civil society, he said that we are coming to your country on our terms, and it is your responsibility to ensure that we come into your country on your terms, because we have business interests and we will keep pushing business interests. I know that Trump is eccentric and all that, but if he is defending American interests, his war with UAE is about what America benefits from the ICT, and industry. So we have not reached that level, Ibrahim, and I'm afraid we are just going to be whimpering on the side and hoping that the Chinese benevolence is going to keep on happening, and that's bad news for Africa.
Your country, Ghana, is ranked by the African Exponent as one of the top 10 most indebted countries to China. I think it might be about $3 billion or maybe more than that. So what do you think Ghana has gained from this huge financial relationship or loan relationship with China? What has your country gained, or what do you think your country is hoping to gain from this relationship, Peter?
Over the years, Ghana has been a great partner to China, I must say, especially when it comes to infrastructure financing in Ghana. I would say about 5, 10, 15 years ago, we had a lot of infrastructure deficits regarding transport, that is road, internal domestic flight issues, railways, and a whole lot of other infrastructure deficits. I mean, public goods and all those stuff. So China had been, I think from 2013, we had about 1.3 billion from China to finance few infrastructures in Ghana, including bridges, roads, some interchange, and then that of the airports. So China has been a good help to Ghana. And 3 years ago, we are also hoping to get about $19 billion from China. In exchange for a bauxite reserve. So China will be mining our bauxite and we'll be getting about $19 billion from China. So the relationship is very strong with China, not just about the financing, but also about the trade. We trade a lot with China here. I'm not able to give the statistics between China and Ghana when it comes to trade volumes. However, there's been a lot of trade volumes between China and Ghana, primarily for private. So China has this kind of sending in their finished product to Ghana, whereas we send them our primary goods. And then there has been a situation where, even though we are benefiting from this financing, we are also losing a lot on our environment. Ghana over the years had lost a lot of its forest reserves due to illegal gold mining involving Chinese individuals. And because this DRI is about people to people and then government to government, The government to government issues, when it comes to financing, it's very huge and it looks beneficial. But the people to people BRI is dangerous to Ghana's environment. And each and every month we are arresting Chinese illegal miners in Ghana. So they have capitalized on the infrastructure financing, and they are also abusing the mining industries in Ghana by going to this illegal mining profession. And that is the dangerous aspect of what in Ghana. However, I must say, getting the financing really helped Ghana. And the government of Ghana is always looking up to China than even going to the European Union, the IMF, or the World Bank. Even though we just left the IMF facility, I think getting billions of dollars from China is what Ghana government is going to go so that it can finance its infrastructure deficit. And it's really helping us a lot in Ghana, I must say. And then thirdly, there has been the influx of Chinese in Ghana, a lot of Chinese in Ghana. Even you have a Chinese community huge in Ghana here. And apart from the illegal activity, they have other illegal, apart from the illegal mining activities, there are other illegal activities that the Chinese also engage in Ghana here. And because of the volume of financing we are receiving from Ghana, and I do not know the deals the government to government signatures, Chinese are able to go into other forms of illegal activities in Ghana, which the Ghana government is able to frown on and connive with the government. And sometimes either we deport them or we allow them to stay in Ghana. So beneficially, yes. However, our environment is in trouble because of the government to government and people to people.
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, of course, it's quite obvious that a lot of countries are benefiting from China and others are not really benefiting. So, Anna, just to wrap things up from your hand, what do you think should be the engagement strategy for African governments going into these agreements with China? First, to make sure that we get enough from this agreement. Second of all, to make sure we're not exposing our environment, as Peter said. And third of all, to make sure we're not actually making our national assets and other valuables vulnerable in this agreement, especially considering the fact that these agreements are secretive. We do not know many of them. So what's going to be your advice for African governments, Anna?
Yeah, well, first of all, we are constantly saying that my consultancy is constantly saying, one, we need a sort of blueprint from an African Union perspective of what the overall engagement with China, like what is the best, where are the best places for China to be investing, especially in real projects, that sort of thing, where it's very, very difficult to get financed from other players for various reasons. There are some really important areas there. But more specifically, we do believe that every single African country should be having a China strategy, and a China strategy which is not just government, within internal, because of course many of them do, but something which is open to the public for people to understand, and specifically for Chinese to understand. The Chinese government is wanting to know, and even the Chinese private sector players wanting to know, what do African governments actually want? What do African people actually want from the relationship? And they don't have enough information about that, and also enough information about the differentiation. Two things that I think should be right in the kind of forefront of those strategies. First of all, and I want to kind of agree with Chris about trade, but on the other hand also disagree a little bit with Rejoice, in the sense that I feel that we do have some power, and our power is in our people, our youth. We are the youngest continent in the world. We will continue to be, while lots of other countries have aging populations, shrinking populations, and China in particular. China is the world's largest manufacturing hub right now, and we have the potential as the continent, African countries, to be the world's next manufacturing hub. We have to safeguard. And I think the Ghana example, there's lots of other examples even from Kenya as well, being able to kind of manage and enforce our own regulations. We really need to do that. It's not easy, because we do have the C word, we have the corruption word, but eventually we'll get there. And the other thing we need to have in those strategies is this issue around trade. We need to be trying to, if we think about the US China relationship. US market is growing by 1% every year, you know, and these are economies which are kind of pretty much the same size, right? You know, China says it's the second largest economy. The IMF at one point said that it was the first and then revised it. These economies which are very big, the US market is growing by 1%. The Chinese market is growing by 16%. You know, these are consumers that are demanding at a very, very high rapid level. And if we can get our products into this market, we have a great opportunity. So those two things, they're kind of quite complementary. We have factories. If we have more manufacturing in the continent, we can be adding more value. But we also need extra policies, protection of our intellectual property on the continent. When our products are abroad, we have to be also managing those sorts of things. These are things that governments need to be thinking about very, very carefully, being very, very intentional. And I don't see it happening enough. So we all need to put the pressure on that.
Well, that's sort of, you know, encapsulate the trade-based or market-based relation we need to construct with China, as echoed by everyone else. But Chris, so your final salvo here, what do you think should be the engagement strategy for African countries, you know, moving on with China?
So just in a nutshell, I think for African countries have tried the socialist experiment for decades. We've tried government-led growth, if you want to call it that, for years. We focused on and waited on governments to improve things. So I think the focus in the future should be strong property rights, the rule of law, strong constitutions, and accountability to the people. As Hannah mentioned, the potential in Africa is crazy if you think about it on an exponential level. So if we just get these things in place now, get it clear now, it doesn't matter who we trade with, whether it's China, the US, whomever, Europe, Russia, just make clear that we want trade to be a win-win, that we want it to be beneficial for our own people as well. And then let's pursue the economic freedom route. Let's try that for a change.
So Rejoice, I think your government listening better in Zimbabwe, or perhaps I'm wrong though. So what's going to be your advice for the Zimbabwean government and other Southern African governments, or perhaps the continent generally? Rejoice.
Right. Basically, Ibrahim, I have 2 points here. First of all, as Zimbabweans, we want to have an independent audit, a very independent and quantifiable audit of what has this $11 billion that we borrowed from China, how has it added and changed our lives? We need to have facts and figures, then we can be able to understand. Perhaps we misunderstand the relationship, but before we actually do an independent, you know, audit and survey of exactly what this $11 billion we were given by China, how it has benefited us, it might be very difficult to proceed. And secondly, I think we also need to encourage the Chinese to understand that, you know, doing business with illiberal governments is not good business. I mean, corruption and, you know, self-centeredness and selfishness and greed, these are the motives that drive these, you know, African, you know, presidents, these Mnangagwas of the world, to have a relationship with China, which does not benefit the common man. So it's not enough, it's not good enough to say we don't want to interfere in the sovereignty of a country. Because you are doing business with a corrupt regime, how does it add value to our lives? So the dynamics, the geopolitics that we're talking about, there must be a way of, you know, putting a political, factor in that model of governance, and then you can bring it down to have a private business sector to drive the relationship with China.
All right, great. So Peter, what will be your final salvo?
Right. So what I'll say is it will be very important that you have the regional bodies negotiating on behalf of countries. For example, you have the ECOWAS rather negotiating on behalf of maybe Ghana or Nigeria, or you have the African Union having, as Hannah said, to some extent, having a Chinese trade strategy document, or any technical document that could serve as a blueprint or a benchmark for all countries to leverage or engage China. But it looks the individual countries do not have the capacity to engage China and benefit more than what they expected to gain. So having a regional body, ECOWAS and the ICA and the rest, doing that would help more than the individual countries engaging China, because, you know, all these things are coming to government. But if you have the regional bodies, it becomes stronger to engage China, because China is a strong economy. And a country like Ghana, Senegal, Chad, or Togo engaging Ghana, or even Kenya engaging Ghana, it's not enough, because China is huge. So you might just come together and serve as a regional body, then have a strong voice and see how best we can negotiate with China. So the benefit will be more than what individual countries are gaining. I think that should be the best strategy for Africans to go.
All right, great. Thank you guys for your great points, and thank you to Anna for joining us from Beijing. And take care, everybody. Be safe.
Take care. Bye.